Okay, hello everyone. I'm Angie. I'm one of the adult services librarians at Carnegie-Stout. Tonight we have a special guest coming to us all the way from the Pacific Northwest, Seattle. Her name is Betsy Hanson, and she is going to discuss her writing process and the story of her publication journey and all sorts of fun stuff. So we'll have time for question and answer sessions throughout. So keep stuff in mind. If you have any questions, feel free to put it in the chat or raise your hand or just go ahead and ask. But a little bit of information on Miss Hanson. Her novel, Always Gardenia. Let's see, let me just do a little visual here. We've got a copy here. We're giving away this hardcover copy. I believe it is signed to one of the folks who are here tonight. Yeah, signed copy from Betsy. And then we have 2 copies that are in Carnegie-Stout Library collection. So you'll be able to work soon enough. So her novel, Always Gardenia, was featured on Nancy Pearl's Book Lust TV program and has found readers from across the world. Ms. Hanson has received grants from 2 Seattle arts organizations to support a recording of the audiobook version of the novel, which I believe she's working on right now.
Right, yeah.
Yeah. And then she's received writer's grants from the Elizabeth George Foundation and the City of Seattle. And for 10 years, Ms. Hanson wrote book reviews for the New York Times Book Review. And she is co-editor and translator of This Kind of Woman, the first English translation of fiction by 20th century Japanese women writers. That is from Stanford University Press. Her short plays have been produced at theaters in the Puget Sound region and in California. And her radio drama called New Digs will be posted online in late November 2021. Ms. Hanson grew up in Champaign-Urbana, Illinois, and has lived in Seattle since 1977. So without further ado, I will hand things over to our esteemed writer, Betsy. Welcome, Betsy. Thank you for being here.
Oh, Angie, thank you so much for organizing this. I just am so pleased. I just love doing these presentations. And I hope that some of what I have experienced, my experiences might help you, if any of you are writers, which I know Gina is, might help you with your writing process and publishing process, and that you might learn something that I didn't know and spent a lot of time learning, and maybe I can help you expedite your writing and your publishing process. So I often start these presentations by reading from the first chapter of my novel. It's called Always Gardenia, as Angie said, and I will just put on my reading glasses and go right for it. Always Gardenia, chapter 1. And let me know if I'm loud enough, okay? Maybe that's Arnold Wiggins, Gardenia Pitkin thought, as the man a few yards ahead of her on the path unsnapped the leash on a copper-colored dachshund. Checking over his shoulder first, he stooped down to harvest a jonquil from the bed where it stood sentry with dozens of others in the pale March in Seattle sunshine. The man slipped the jonquil into one pocket of his navy windbreaker. From the other, he pulled what looked to be tea bags, as if checking to make sure he had provisioned himself, and then slipped them back in again. No one else was treading through the campus of the University of the Northwest at 8:30 in the morning, so it was likely that the dachshund lover and flower plucker was Dr. Arnold Wiggins. As acting chair of the Department of English, he would make the final decision on hiring Gardenia as the administrative assistant for the department. He could be from central casting for English professors, Gardenia thought, with his baggy khakis and rumpled curly hair and soft-soled Oxfords. Even the dachshund, trotting along tetherless and veering from the path with his nose to the ground, was an appropriately eccentric accessory. I will tell him right away that we share a fondness for dachshunds, Gardenia thought, though my Susie is of miniature lineage and his fellow a noble standard. With a crisp whistle, must be Dr. Wiggins beckoned the dog and snapped on the leash before unlocking the door to the Arts and Sciences building. "Excuse me," Gardenia called as she hurried to the entrance. "I'm Gardenia Pitkin." Hearing her name hang in the morning quiet, Gardenia felt her cheeks flush. Well, what if this isn't Arnold Wiggins? What if this is someone who has no reason to know my name at all? a denizen of the philosophy department, or a visiting Bulgarian historian, or even a custodian. But the man turned and smiled. Oh, a timely arrival indeed. I forgot to mention in my email that the building would be locked because of spring break. He extended his hand. Arnold Wiggins, acting chair, taking over for Dr. Gludger. Thank you for agreeing to meet me at this early hour. No problem. And this is? Gardenia knelt and offered her fist for the dachshund to sniff. Leroy, well behaved enough to be my office mate. Dog dander is never a problem. Dachshunds are well known for their hypoallergenic qualities. Oh, I know, Gardenia said. I have a dachshund too, though she's a cross between a long-haired and a wire-haired. Scruffy and smaller, but still a dachshund. Arnold Wiggins smiled, showing slightly prominent teeth. We already have something in common. We'll take the stairs if you don't mind. We're on the second floor. He picked Leroy up, carefully supporting the dog's hindquarters and thus certifying him as one who knew the fragility of the lowrider back. Gardenia had hoped to have a chance to dodge into the restroom to brush her hair and regloss her lips before her appointment, but she sensed that Dr. Wiggins would not notice nor care about such last-minute primping. He unlocked one of the wide French doors leading to the English department. From one of the back offices came the drone of a female voice. Ah, it must be our esteemed poetry professor, Frida Ham, one of the few who can't refrain from working even during spring break. Hello, Wiggins here, he called. When there was no response, he whispered to Gardenia, indeed, the mesmerizing qualities of John Donne. May I ask you to wait a moment while I get the good fellow settled? Oh, of course. Gardenia sat in a chair near what appeared to be the desk for the administrative assistant and with a clear view of Arnold Wiggins' office. She watched as he coaxed the purloined jonquil into a thin-necked white vase on his office windowsill and filled Leroy's food bowl from a bag of kibble in the bottom drawer of the file cabinet. Gardenia had not noticed whether he wore a wedding ring, but she would put money on the notion that he was a childless bachelor, though why she concluded such a thing, she wasn't sure. Maybe it was the way he treated Leroy as if a child substitute, or perhaps his styleless jacket and trousers. A good wife would have insisted that he put on nicer things for a first meeting with a potential employee. I used to give Tory editorial comments on his clothes, Gardenia recalled, on days when he was lost in his math teacher concerns and didn't realize that he had a dab of teriyaki sauce on his shirt or that he'd worn the same cords 4 days in a row. The droning had stopped. A small, sturdy pony of a woman in jeans and a brown sweatshirt emerged from one of the back offices, leading a taller, younger woman who seemed to be the exact opposite appearance-wise, with her straight planks of white blonde hair, trim red jacket, and long legs in slender black trousers. Where's Dr. Wiggins? The sturdy pony asked. We've been waiting for him. In his office. Gardenia stood up and extended her hand. I'm Gardenia Pitkin. I'm interviewing for the administrative assistant job. Frida Ham, I teach poetry, or should I say about poetry, and poets. None of those workshops like the others do. Her adamant tone indicated that this was something she was either proud of or expected she would have to defend. And I am Laurel Dubar. The blonde shook Gardenia's hand. Dr. Dubar, Frida said. She's the new postmodern adjunct for just this quarter. Where's Arn? He stepped out of the office. Arnold Wiggins, Chaucer specialist and acting chair. With a quick bow, he offered his hand, which Dr. Dubar shook with authority. I thought you said 8:15, or maybe I entered it in my calendar wrong. The door to the building was locked, but fortunately Frida had just arrived and let me in. Dr. Dubar pulled on a silver hoop earring. Oh, my apologies, Dr. Wiggins said. I told her to look around while I did my early morning reciting, Frida said. Excuse me, but some of us don't take much of a vacation. I have to get back to my lesson plans. Thanks for letting me in, Dr. Dubar said, and Frida called, no worries, as she headed back to her office. Oh, we're lucky to have you on short notice, what with Dr. Gludger suddenly deciding to retire after his heart attack scare. Dr. Wiggins jammed his hands into the pockets of his khakis. I hope you have had enough time to prepare for your classes. At this, Dr. DeBar tossed her hair and fiddled again with the silver hoop. I have had almost no time to prepare. Oh, indeed, my apologies. Dr. Wiggins raked his tangle of graying auburn curls. For the second time in about half a minute, you've apologized to her, and now you're even blushing, Gardenia thought. And she is the new hire who should be deferential to you. Never mind, Dr. DeVar said. I'd like to see my office. Oh, indeed, right away. Dr. Wiggins turned to Gardenia. Would you like to join us? A tour of the premises? Oh, sure. Leading Dr. DeBar down the hall, Dr. Wiggins patted the windbreaker pocket that held the tea bags. This sleek young lady wouldn't appreciate a mug of tea, Gardenia thought. More the espresso macchiato type. This is the office of Dr. Gludger, now happily living in, we hope, heart-healthy retirement on Lopez Island, Dr. Wiggins said as he opened a door at the far end of the hallway. One of the few offices with 2 sets of windows. Dr. DeBar strode into Dr. Gludger's office with its lonely landscape of empty bookcases and denuded desktop and strode right out again. He smoked, didn't he? Well, Dr. Gludger did go outside to the service entrance to have a cigarette, but the entire building is smoke-free, Dr. Wiggins said. It doesn't matter. It comes in with them on their clothes. Can't you smell it? It's not too bad, Gardenia said, even though she had noticed the odor as soon as Dr. Wiggins had opened the door. No one told me I would have an office that smells of cigarette smoke. Is there another one I could use? Unfortunately, the inn is full, you might say, Dr. Wiggins said. At this, Dr. DeBar plunked her leather satchel on the desk and knelt down to sniff the carpet. The stink has soaked into the carpet. Can you arrange to have it replaced? Replaced? As I recall, there is a facilities budget. I can investigate the available sums. From his non-teabag holding windbreaker pocket, Dr. Wiggins dug out a small notebook and a stub of pencil and scribbled something with a flourish. I'll discuss this with Hamilton Dodge, the Dean of Arts and Sciences. I believe you met him when you interviewed? Dr. DeBar stood up and adjusted the waistband of her slacks, not replying to the question. Hate to be a complainer on my first day. About time you realized how demanding you're being, Gardenia thought. But it makes no sense to set up my office until that odor is gone. I'll go home and work there today, Dr. Wigham. Wiggins? He peeped. But do call me Arnold. Oops. Okay, Arn, thanks for your trouble. A miasma of flowery scent wafted around Dr. DeBar as she passed Gardenia on the way to the door. Not appropriate for an academic setting, Gardenia thought, but it does explain why she is so touchy about the smell of an office carpet. We're lucky to have Dr. DeBar, an instructor of such stellar credentials, Dr. Wiggins said to Gardenia. But now, about your position, I can't say it's the most scintillating work in the world, but we generally don't bother the secretary, the administrative assistant, too much. The odd copying job, maybe a letter of recommendation, students coming in with drop ad forms. Oh, and the ones who are in tears over an A- and want to know if they can get a grade change. Oh, I have a son a few years older than these students, Gardenia said, so I know the age group, quite like it. And the office is pleasant. As far as I'm concerned, the final interview is hereby finished. You are duly employed. Dr. Wiggins shook Gardenia's hand and pulled the tea bags from his pocket. May I offer you a cup of tea, Mun? Oh, yes, please. Sugar? Milk? Milk, please. Arnold loped down the hall to the department's kitchenette, holding the tea bags by their strings, one in each hand, as if taking them for a walk. I'll suggest renting one of those carpet cleaners, Gardenia thought, and I can show him how to use it. Not in my job description, but I'm betting that the facilities budget is not for paper clips and copy paper and other dribs and drabs, nor a new carpet. It's clear that Dr. Wiggins, whatever his relationship status may be, was no match for the requests of a young female professor who could easily be featured on a billboard for Iceland Air. So that's the first half of the first chapter. Thank you for listening. I think there's some writers among you and certainly avid readers. So Angie, do we want to just open up to questions from the participants and I can spin off from there?
Yeah, does anyone else have any questions to start with so far? Is everybody muted? I was talking to you the other day, Betsy. We were talking about the process of you had all of your ephemera, was it, that you had lots of different things that you'd piece together to create book. I was wondering if you could start talking about the beginning of the process.
Okay. And does that work for everybody? Does anyone have a specific question or does that work? Who isn't, Gina's a writer. Are there other writers among the group here?
Not I.
Okay, great. So I think often when we talk to authors, we hear about authors, one thing I'm always interested in is how did a book start? And this book started basically with two things. One, I am a big fan of the British novelist Barbara Pym, P-Y-M. Have any of you read her? Is she in your collection? Did we talk about that, Angie? I think we've decided.
I just read An Unsuitable Attachment about 2 months ago from the library's collection.
Did you like it?
Oh, I adore Pym. I adore Pym.
Oh, that's great. That's great. So I've long been a fan of Barbara Pym, and Anna, you might relate to this. Those of us who love Barbara Pym, she's written how many, I think 10, 12 novels? Maybe not that many. I should know that number. But when we're finished reading all of her novels, we are just bereft because we're thinking, what else can we read that will satisfy us as much? Maybe you have some authors that you feel the same way about.
Well, I like Angela Thirkle, but she's not as serious. She's much more
Pym.
Yeah, much more superficial than Pym.
Yeah.
Pym is marvelous.
And she's very funny.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So I said to myself, I said, well, what if I were to try to write a book that is not like Barbara Pym? I could never presume to have her kind of genius. But what if I tried to channel some of her wry wit, some of her ways that she deals with human interactions, her love of what she would call trivialities, which really small things that make up our lives. What if I tried to write a book that was in the style of Pym, but it was my own book, and it would be the kind of book that maybe I would want to read? So I started with that idea. And then my other question was, the other thing that started it off was, I started with a question. And I think for someone, this worked really well for me to start with a question. And I might recommend, if anyone wants to start a novel, that's a good way to start, because if you have a question, then you're going to spend your whole process of writing the book trying to answer that question. So it gives you kind of a target. So this was my question. I have 2 grown sons. Neither of them are married, but many years ago, one of them had a girlfriend that my husband and I did not like. She's long gone, but at the time it looked pretty serious. And I thought, what if I had a daughter-in-law that I didn't like, and I had to be nice to her so that I could keep access to my grandchild? I think not an unknown problem in world history. So that was what started me off. And then I thought of who is that woman with the daughter-in-law that she doesn't like. And I just came up with this image of this woman. She would be in her mid-50s with a grown son. And maybe it was a marriage that happened sooner than it needed to, or might have, because they had a child, something like that. And then I decided, well, when you have a character, your protagonist in a novel, there need to be lots of problems and obstacles for that person to move through as you go through the story. So to make her life more difficult, I made her a widow. I am not a widow, but I have some friends who were widowed young. So I know a little bit about what they've been through. So I came up with this character who eventually was named Gardenia. I sat down and I wrote, oh, here comes another kitty. I've got two kitties. I'll show you this one. I sat down, I had a day job at the time, and I'd get up in the morning and I would write 500 words a day, usually, sometimes more. And I just sort of let it go. I just sort of let it flow. And I wrote this huge long draft over several months. It ended up to be about 300 pages. And I just thought I was something cool that I had written this huge manuscript. Fortunately, I put it away. Things intervene in my life and I put it away for a while. And then probably a year or more later, I pulled it out and I read it again and I was like, oh, this is a lot of work. And interestingly, the protagonist in that version was called Priscilla. And I saw that name and I thought, no, I don't like that name because it sounds like prissy. And somehow the name Gardenia came to my mind. I don't know anybody named Gardenia. I don't know where that name came from, but I liked it. And I particularly liked it because the book involves lots of botanical references. We're following the story through spring into early summer. And so there are lots of things blooming and there's a lot of reference to different plants and flowers and things. So I thought the name Gardenia would work. Also, it was unusual. So I thought it would maybe stick in readers' minds. And Pitkin also was a name I'd heard. Some neighbor of mine had that last name. So I gave her that name. And then I decided she was going to have a friend, that the second most important character was going to be this academic. I had spent several years working in a university setting, teaching. And so I felt I kind of knew that world. And it's a pretty interesting world to be in, lots of small dramas and politics and things over very small things. So I wanted another character to be someone, an academic. And so I came up with this image of this English professor who was a Chaucer specialist, again, trying to give him some particular attribute. And I got his name, Arnold Wiggins. I don't know, again, where that name came from, which, by the way, I seem to have sort of a naming angel who floats around my head. And when I need a name, it drops into my brain. And I do think names are important because they can indicate quite a bit about character. And you also want your names to be distinctive enough that that readers identify the novel with that name. So I'm sure we can all think of like George Smiley. Wasn't that the detective in the John le Carré novels? I mean, that's such a great name, last name of Smiley. Anyway, so I had the name of Arnold Wiggins, but I couldn't quite picture him. And I did have actually a little dachshund at the time I was writing this. And I took her over to the dog park one day, was walking with her in the dog park, and this man walked up with a corgi. And we were mostly looking at our dogs. I didn't exchange names with him. I sort of said hello and we looked at the dogs. And then I looked up at him and I thought, oh my gosh, you are Arnold Wiggins. And so he walked away and never saw him again. But the image of that man was in my mind the whole time I was writing his character. It was sort of funny. So I started.
Little does he know.
Yeah, really, he's been immortalized. So I wrote this 300-page draft. It was not great. I knew I needed some help. And so at that point, I think I worked on it a little bit myself. But then I went ahead and I hired an editor, a professional editor, and had her go over it and give me some tips. And then I did something I probably should have done from the very beginning. I got a book about writing novels that was written by Elizabeth George. Does anybody know Elizabeth George? She's a mystery writer. She's American, but she sets her books in England. Yeah. So she's written this book called Right Away. I didn't pull it out on my shelf to show you, but it's called Right Away. And her belief is that, or you maybe have the newest version. Yeah. Yeah, this is, I think, the same book, but a different title. So she believes that you can actually instruct someone on how to write a novel, and she gives you a very specific recipe on how to do it. You, first of all, write biographies of all your characters, which sounds crazy, but I decided to back up from my book, from what I'd done so far, and write these biographies of all my characters. And she gives you cue words like character analysis prompts: name, age, height, weight, build, birthplace, color of hair and eyes, physical peculiarities, educational background, sexuality, best friend, enemies, family, core need, pathological maneuver. These are very important things in writing a story, because these things, what the character needs and what they're going to do to get that, is part of what drives your story. Ambition in life, gestures when talking, gait, strongest character trait, weakest character trait, laughs or jeers at, philosophy, political leaning, etc. And so I took my characters and I just gave some of a brief outline. And so I took my characters and I said, what are the pluses and minuses for all the characters? Arnold's weaknesses is he's clueless about women. He doesn't assert himself. He's too passive, not inconsiderate, but sometimes doesn't pick up on others' clues. Procrastinator, reliant on his mother. Gardenia's weaknesses: she's envious of others. She blurts out whatever is on her mind. She can be sneaky, will invade the privacy of others when the welfare of her son and grandson are at stake. She agrees to go out and then backs out, won't commit. And she let her husband support her and now resents the fact that she has to work as a secretary. So those are just a few things. And then, look at all this. So I wrote all these biographies of all the characters, many pages. I just sat down and tapped out whatever came to mind using that guide. So here's Arnold's core needs, his pathological maneuver. So you can see there's quite a bit of text here. Why do you do this? This is what keeps you out of the doldrums when you're in the middle of writing a novel, because you come to know your characters very well through this process. So when you're in the middle of the story, and this happens to a lot of people, they have a great start and they kind of have a sense of the ending, and then in the middle they're like, I don't know what's happening. If you know your characters really well, you move from their motivations, their needs, into the rest of the story. And it also helps when you're describing them in scenes, because you can you remember how they speak, how they might dress. She even wants you to know how they walk, what gestures they might use when they're speaking. So all of these help you to flesh out the character as you're going through the story. And then she also suggests that you do a chapter outline, which I here you can see I put each chapter, and then I wrote what was going to happen in the chapter and what were the conflicts in the chapter. Now, when you're writing a story, one of the things, that little mantras that you have, I put up on my bulletin board, is conflict is not an option. You need to have conflict happening throughout the storyline. In every scene, there needs to be something going on between the characters that keeps our interest. What's going to happen next? Conflict makes us wonder what's going to happen next. So for example, for chapter 1, Arnold Wiggins greets Laurel Dubar and Gloria Pitkin. We learn about Leroy, Frida Ham. Laurel Dubar complains about the carpet. Gardenia and Arnold share notes on dachshunds. Gardenia goes to Pioneer Square and meets up with Lex. We meet Sylvie. We learn about her widowhood. And the conflicts are that Laurel Dubar wants Arnold Wiggins to replace her carpet. He's surprised. And then another conflict that's later in the chapter is that Gardenia is not sure about Lex. This is this man she meets later in the chapter. So I did that for every chapter. Of course, when you have something like this, you don't necessarily follow it slavishly, but it gives you, it's like an itinerary on your trip to Europe. You want to go to Paris and to southern France, but if you get sidetracked and go to Brittany because you learn about something cool there, that's okay, but it keeps you on a track. And the other thing I did was to keep a very detailed calendar. And I don't know if anyone ever does. I just sort of figured this out on my own. I don't know if other people do this, but it's something you might consider. So I had an actual start date for the story. You can see the the Sharpie marker here. It starts on this day. And then every scene I plotted into this calendar. And this was so that I could make sure that the plot line worked, so that something that happened on one day then the next scene didn't happen 3 weeks later, and what happened in between, so that I could keep the plot moving and make it very consistent and make it have sense. So you can see I have all these marks here. This was absolutely essential for me because I wanted to be very careful, make sure that everything fit together, that there weren't any weirdnesses about timing. And also I made notes about what was blooming in the environment at that time. We have a very early spring in Seattle. And so things start blooming like at the end of February. I know, eat your heart out. You Midwesterners. So I kept track of, the camellias are blooming now, and now the cherries, and now the tulips, and so when I mentioned them in the book, it was consistent with the time that I was dealing with. Unfortunately, by using this method, it meant that when I changed things, like I did end up dropping some scenes and changing things around, then I had to go back and redo it to make sure that the flow made sense. So I had to do that a couple times when I did some deleting. That was a bit of a pain, but I was totally into doing it. I really wanted this to work well. The other thing I did was, when you write a novel, it's very much, in my mind, like writing a stage play, which I have done, in that you want your characters coming off and on the stage with some consistency. You don't want a character to come on and the stage and then you don't see him again till the very last scene, unless that's part of the plot. But if you have characters that you're involving in the story, you want them to come in and out with some regularity. So I took these cards, these colored cards, and each character had a color. So I wrote each, so that they were, these are for the chapters. So I had a card for each character, and then I could, for each chapter. And so then I laid them out on the floor and I could see where people were appearing. So like for chapter 1, I had a green and a blue and a pink. That meant all those characters were appearing. And then if I looked and I saw that there was another chapter where it was all just one color or just 2 colors, and then that another color hadn't appeared for several chapters, I was like, okay, I need to either rearrange chapters or I need to write in these characters so that they're coming in and out more. Is this all interesting? Anyone have a specific question, or do I keep going?
I was just going to say, Cinda made a comment in the chat where she said your biographical writings on each of your characters could really be helpful when you get asked for Always Gardenia to become a movie.
There we go.
That's a good
Yeah,
one.
bring it on. That, yes, I could definitely do that. I could show them that. Yeah, thank you for that.
One of the things I was gonna mention, is when Betsy and I first started talking about doing a program, it was gonna, or the thought was we might be able to do it last November, which is during NaNoWriMo. And has everybody heard of what NaNoWriMo is? It's a National Writing Month, and every November.
That was one of my first thoughts.
What's that?
That was one of my first thoughts, was whether this was related to NaNoWriMo.
Yeah, that was the original hope, but we couldn't quite get the timing right for that to work in November. But November is every year National Novel Writing Month, and so what I was going to ask you, Betsy, was whether or not, like, for those of us who are wannabers, that's what I call myself, that I really liked what you said about coming up with a question, because for me, when I think about writing, I feel like I have a mood and a feeling, an idea rather than a plot or a story. It's nothing concrete. And I have a hard time, I want to write, and I feel like I could, write poetry or something like that, but to make a concrete story, I don't know how to make the leap from like a mood and a feeling to that. So I like the idea of coming up with a question, of a core question. Do you have any other thought?
Well, and the other thing to me is that a novel is about a person. So you want to start with that question, and the question should be related to the problems or needs of a person, of a character. And then you need to give that character, give that character problems. They need something, and it's going to take them a while to get it. And there's going to be lots of ups and downs to get it. And they're going to meet other people along the way. They say that there are only two kinds of stories, really. One is a stranger comes to town and upsets the status quo. The other is someone goes on a journey. So in many ways, whether it's an actual physical journey or a figurative one, whether it's an actual town or a figurative one, those are kind of two things that can guide a story. And story structure is, I think, part of sort of human DNA. We like stories, and we all know what a good story is. So you can actually study story structure and use some very basic outlines like the hero's journey, or there's some if you look into story structure guides, you can actually just start with your question and your person that you care about. And the person you care about, that your protagonist doesn't have to be someone that's wonderful. As a matter of fact, if they're not wonderful, that could even be better. And then what are the things that they're going to try to get in the course of this novel? What are they going to try to learn? How are they going to be different at the beginning and the end? And if you can start, I think if you start with that question and that protagonist, do some work on the biographies, try to figure out who your characters are, and then get yourself a rough chapter outline. Say you're going to write 200 words. You're going to write 20 chapters of 10 pages each. Give yourself an idea. Just blast it out. What you think those chapters might be. And that'll give you some confidence as you go forward. You won't be just like, oh my gosh, what do I do next? You'll know, okay, in this chapter, I thought maybe I would be writing about this. And then you start in doing that. If it doesn't work that way, that's fine. But at least it makes you do it. It gives you some feeling of confidence that you can do it, rather than just looking at a blank thing. So another thing, does that help, Angie?
It does. And I was going to ask you what you thought about, when a person's making their way into writing, do you believe in editing as you go, or just trying to get kind of like a first draft down?
Yeah, well, I think for every writer has a different way. I am very much about the rough draft, because it feels so good to have a whole thing done, even if it's a real mess. That's probably good. Because when you're starting to write something, you get basically one chance to do it fresh, when you haven't thought about it too much and you're just kind of letting your subconscious go and writing it out. And if you let yourself just do that, type, just write things out. Maybe have your outline so you kind of know which direction you're going, but not be too fussy. Just let it go. Then you have this whole bunch of stuff you can work with. If you start editing as you go, you don't know, you might be cutting out stuff that later on you might have found to be really useful. So yeah, I'm very much about the rough draft. And yet be aware that a rough draft, I would say I probably, before this got to its final editing, I probably did 4 or 5 versions. Sorry about that. Maybe other people are more efficient. I don't know. And I might have been more efficient if I'd started with Elizabeth George books right away, rather than doing a draft and then going back and doing that.
Mm-hmm. Only 4 or 5? That's it?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it could be more. Many times it could be. Yeah. And I have a couple other things about writing that are not everybody agrees with, but I'd like to throw them out there just in case they resonate with some of you. I don't talk about what I'm writing until I have a complete draft. So nobody knew when I was writing this book what it was about, who the characters were, what my goals were. I would tell my husband and friends, I'm writing a novel. It's set in contemporary Seattle. That's all I'd say. The reason being, if I started to talk too much about it, well, it's about this widow and she goes to get this job and then she meets this guy and her son is his wife. Somehow I've then dispelled my need to write it because I've told the story. So I am super private about what I'm doing when I'm doing it. The other thing that's different in my process from a lot of people is I'm not a big fan of writers groups. And I've been in them off and on, but I no longer participate in writers groups. And I do have one friend who's a writer and we share some of our things, but I don't even really have a person that I share my work with. And the reason for that is I think many writers groups want you to share things as you go along. And I think that a writer needs a chance to make that huge rough draft in private, letting their minds just range and roam and writing down whatever they want to, and not feeling like they're going to be judged or critiqued until they are ready, until they no longer know, until the writer no longer knows what to do anymore, or has answered his or her own questions and now just maybe has a few more questions that would like to ask. Also, unfortunately, I think writers groups can become incubators for some of the less desirable characteristics of human beings, i.e. competition and a sense of competition. And it's very hard when you're in a writers group and you have some people who are doing really well and being very successful and other people who are really struggling. It's very hard for the people who are struggling sometimes to really know what to do with the really successful people. It can be very intimidating and even discouraging. And sometimes people are not very nice in their critique. Even though they're told they're supposed to be nice, sometimes they're not. And it can be devastating to people. If someone who's writing you admire in your group says 3 words that you don't like, it can just torpedo you. So I do personally like being very private, working on a draft on my own, then revising it on my own, and then I go hire an editor. And I spend good money on a professional editor. And to me, we spend so much money on things, like a trip to Europe or new car or going on vacation or buy a new TV. And people I've talked to kind of balk when I tell them that I hire an editor. But after all that love and time and care you've given to this manuscript, it's sort of like raising this wonderful child and then sending them off to the coal mines or something. You want to keep it going. You want to support that manuscript and get the best help you can for it. And so those are my personal choices. Other people are different. Other people get a lot of help from their writers groups. They swear by them. And so there are all kinds of ways to do it.
Gina,
Betsy, my father was a writer,
Uh-huh.
and he used to say that writers don't talk about what they're writing. If you're talking about your writing, then you're not writing. You're talking.
Okay, I'm validated then. Thank you, Anna.
Exactly. That he just said people who talk about their writing are more interested in being seen as a writer and being acknowledged and talking about their writing. They're not interested in the process, and they're not interested in saying something, and whatever their message is.
Yeah. They want to be a writer, not do a writer. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
A couple other things. Anything else specific that anyone else, or not specific, or was that helpful, Angie?
absolutely. I was thinking about idea of keeping it to yourself, the first thing you were talking about, and how if you were telling friends, oh, I'm writing this story and this, it's about this and this and this, I can see where early influence, like if someone said, well, why are you setting it in Dubuque? It's kind of dumb, or something, or whatever.
Yeah.
Why are you setting it there, or why is your main character a doctor, or some question that when you're just at the beginning, I can see where that would totally, without knowing what you're working on or without knowing the true depth, but just the idea, I just think that I can appreciate that as keep it.
To me, it's
incubated.
interesting that writers groups are just so common, and people, go to MFA programs where all they're doing is being in writers groups all the time. And frankly, I think writers groups are often a way, particularly ones where you have to pay, are a way for writers to make some money, and who knows if they really even know how to teach other people to write. I'm not sure. I came up with an analogy about writing groups for fiction writers or anyone doing a longer piece. What if you were in a poetry workshop? So often in writers groups, they'll say, bring in your first chapter. Okay. So what if you were in a poetry workshop and the instructor said, bring in the first 2 lines of your poem? Everyone would think, that's crazy. How can you tell me anything about my poem if it's only the first 2 lines? And to me, that's similar to telling someone to bring in their first chapter. How can you possibly tell anything about what they're doing in the first chapter? But your point, I think, is really well made, Angie, that all it takes is an arched eyebrow when you tell someone what you're thinking about working on, and you can immediately lose confidence. So a couple other pointers, or not, I don't really call them pointers because this is just me, may not work for you, but something that really worked for me is I chose as my locale Seattle because I live here, and I knew that I could do research on settings and sensory detail very easily. And it's very exciting to set a novel in some other place where you get to go and learn about that place, and that could be great. But for me, I wanted to make it as easy as possible to get the kind of data I wanted to use for the book. And so I set it here. The other thing is that I'm a real believer in what I call veracity in fiction. I want everything in my fictional world to cohese, to be absolutely true and right in that world. So I wanted to be able to, as I said, log in what was blooming at certain times, to look at the calendar and see, was there a holiday in there that they would have been aware of that I would have needed to mention, like Easter came up, and various things like that. And so I went around with a notebook to every single locale that is mentioned in the book, and I took notes. And then I used those notes when I was creating the scenes. And I needed a house. I needed a place for Arnold Wiggins to live. And so I walked around this one neighborhood on a very hot day, it's one August, and I found this house. It was an older house that had been divided into 2 apartments, one on the first floor, one on the second floor. I thought, okay, that's where Arnold Wiggins lived. And it happened to be right across the alley from a Russian Orthodox church. Have you seen those kind of onion dome churches, maybe? Just a small little Russian Orthodox church. And so that was a nice detail that then I worked into the book. Well, it was interesting. I had a reader, someone I don't know, somebody who lives in Seattle, a guy who read the book and he enjoyed it, and he wrote to me and he said, oh, I've lived in that neighborhood that you mentioned for many years, and I thought all the Seattle scenes were just seamless. And he said, as a matter of fact, I used to live down the street from Arnold Wiggins. So it was so funny because it was like, I was like, well, actually, he's not a real person, but hey, thought that was very funny. And the other thing that really helps, I think, when you're telling a story is to keep particularly when you're learning how, is to keep the time frame really tight. So my story happens between late March and the first week of June of the same year. If you have that kind of tight time frame, it's much easier to keep the pace going. You don't have huge gaps in the story where you wonder, well, what were the characters doing for those 3 months? So I would highly recommend that as well as a technique when you're just learning. Yeah. The other thing you want to do is to educate yourself on standard manuscript form. And I've been surprised. I've had some writers approach me to read over their manuscripts for them. And they're often quite experienced writers. And I was very surprised to learn that they did not know standard manuscript form. And if you don't know it, you immediately, when you're submitting something, look like you don't know what you're doing. I don't care how good your writing is. If you don't know the standard format, you look totally amateurish. So it's pretty basic. It's 12-point type, usually Times Roman, double spaced, 1-inch margins all the way around. You start each chapter in the middle of the page. Generally, people want you to put a header with your last name, the name of the manuscript, and then the page number in the top left, top right corner. And that's it. That's it. It's very easy, but people don't know it. And I've seen people give me manuscripts that they're like single spaced paragraphs with a double space in between. And, no, I'm sorry, I'm not going to even read this until you go back and put it in standard manuscript format. For one thing, it's to your benefit to learn it. The other is it's too hard to read without it. So that's something. Yeah. Just looking, anything else? Anything else about the writing process?
Gina, did you have any thoughts on writing or writing with a writers group? Because I know you've done a little bit of that. Did you have any thoughts on that too?
Yeah, well, you definitely get interesting feedback, right? With the writers group. I didn't have a negative experience with it. But I do appreciate like this, the solitary activity, right? The solitary activity that writing is. So I'm fine to kind of live in my head and, do that as well. So I can appreciate that, just wanting to do it on your own and then getting a professional to help you, restructure, clean it up after. It's probably a much more efficient way to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I put in the comments about Lisa Crone, Wired for Story, when you were talking about
okay.
that natural. Yeah, she's been a real, provided real good insight for me.
That's
Is that a book? Is that a book?
Yeah, it's a book. It's a book on writing, on the writing process.
Yeah, there's some great story structure guides out there. Another one that I've used in the past is called How to Write a Damn Good Novel. And there's another one called How to Write a Damn Good Mystery. And this guy is like a really straight shooter. He's like, okay, you got to do this. You got to do this. Don't do that. Do this. It's a little bit kind of like, okay. But very practical, very practical.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
When you were talking about setting, I thought that was, interesting, obviously walking around and seeing a house. I've gone on realtor websites so I can because I had, I needed a lot of interior description of the house. And so many, many years ago, I found a house that was for sale in the town that I was, that my novel is set in. And that's been my house. That is the house in my head.
Yeah.
It had pictures with it, right? You can see the layout of the house. So that was a real.
Yeah, you can picture your characters in that place.
Exactly.
And you're moving through the rooms. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Did you want me to talk a little bit about my publishing journey?
Yeah, I'd like to hear.
Okay.
A bit about that for sure.
So so I had this big chunky 300-page manuscript. I hired someone to go over it with me, and then I revised it. And then I think I had a couple friends read it, just although frankly, they didn't give me very good advice. They didn't really give me any advice. I mean, they're very literate people. One's a published poet. The other one is my probably most best read friend in the world. But they didn't really give me anything useful. They gave me like typos or something like that. But that's again why I just think hiring professionals is so important, because they just tell it to you. They're like, that, I don't like this chapter, you know, or this doesn't make sense, or, you know, they don't have anything, they have no vested interest in keeping your friendship or anything like that. So, so then at that point, I put it aside, and then I decided, okay, that thing's just sitting there. I'm going to try to get it out. I'm going to see if I can find an agent. So I looked, because my book is in homage to this writer, Barbara Pym, I decided I was going to look and see if there are any agents who like Barbara Pym. So thank you, Internet. I punched in agent Barbara Pym, and up popped this guy who said someone had interviewed him, and he said, oh, I like things like the books of Barbara Pym. So I found him on the web. I found his website. I found where the agency that he worked for. I got his address, and it turned out that they wanted a paper submission, which, as you know, Gina, is somewhat unusual now. Generally, they want like the first 10 pages plus a query on the through email. But they wanted the first 10 pages in paper, stuck in an envelope, and mailed to them. So I said, okay. So I got an envelope, and I put his name on it, and then put the stuff in there. And then I put at the side, I put, attention, novel in homage to Barbara Pym. Because I thought maybe that would make it rise to the top of the slush pile. So I mailed it. Now this, you're not going to want to hear this, Gina. I mailed it on a Thursday, and on Tuesday he called me. And he said, and I had been thinking, now Gina knows this, you know, usually when you submit to an agent, it takes like 6 weeks, 2 months, maybe you never hear from him again. I have to say, I was not quite done with that book. I wanted to revise the last chapter. I didn't quite know how it was going to end. And so I thought, well, it's going to take forever to hear from anybody, and I have time. And so he called me, and he said, I'd like to see the full thing. I was like, oh, okay, I'll get it right off to you. But I do have to go visit my elderly mother in Illinois this next week. So it might be another week before I can get it to you. Which actually was true. I was going to Urbana to visit my mom. So I took the whole thing with me. I went over it. I thought about it, and I still didn't have an ending. And then just one day I sat down, I just quickly wrote this ending, and I was like, oh, okay. So I sent it off to him. And then he called back, and he said, yep, I think I'd like to represent this. We might need to work on it a little bit, but I'd like to represent it. And by the way, I really liked the ending. So long story short, he had that thing for about 2 years. He sent it out all over the place. Nobody wanted it. No publishing house wanted it. They'd say things like, oh, I like this, I like that, but it's not right for our list, and blah, 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 blah. And then after about 2 years, I could see he was losing interest. I wasn't hearing from him. I think he'd kind of gone through all the editors he thought would want it. And I think he kind of wanted me gone. So it was, in the end, a frustrating experience. However, he was very encouraging of me, and he was very encouraging of the book. And that helped a lot. And that gave me the confidence that if it was probably good enough to go out and self-publish. That I never wanted to self-publish. Never, never, never. But I also decided time's a wasting. I don't want to have my new book in my lap when I'm drooling in my wheelchair, you know. So I decided I was going to take the plunge and self-publish. Now, my problem with self-publishing is most people don't get good editing help. They have their friend or the person who got an English degree or somebody like that. They don't hire a good professional editor. And I was also concerned that I wanted to find somebody who would really be tough and not just take my money and say, oh yeah, that's great, you know, bye. Fortunately, through the internet, I was able to find this really great editor. She lives in Seattle. We met in person. I told her about the project. I gave her the manuscript and I said, would you sit down and read this as if you had just pulled it off the shelf of a library or a bookstore? I don't want fussy editing. I just want you to read it through. Tell me, did it keep your interest? Were there places it was slow? I called it a teapot read. I wanted her to have a pot of tea and my manuscript and just read it. So she did that. And then she wrote me an editorial letter, a couple pages, and she picked up on things that I'd hoped a reader would like. So then I hired her to do what's called a copy edit. And I have a copy here of some of the marks that she made. I don't know how you can see this, but it's very detailed. She, went over like every sentence and marked up, questions like this. This is what a good editor is going to do. Every page will have marks on it. And then she gave me what's called a style sheet. This blew my mind. So she went through and made all these notes about what was going on in the text. She has all the characters and their attributes listed so that they would be consistent throughout. And then she has several pages of all the different place names, proper nouns, things like this to make sure that they were consistently used throughout the book. Now, this is what an editor in a publishing house would do. This is what a copy editor in a publishing house would do. And so I just felt so pleased that I was getting that kind of help.
What was that called? A style
Copy it. Oh, this is a style sheet. Yeah.
style sheet?
Yeah. And this is what an editor in a publishing house would do for you. So she has worked for publishing houses, so she knew what to do. Okay, I'm telling you, it was expensive. But I was getting this book ready for publication. And I was basically like a publishing house now. So I was hiring her as if I were a publishing house and she were working for me. And then my other concern with self-published books is that they often look pretty cheap and not really well designed. And so I was very concerned that I get a good book design inside and out. So I found, and I also wanted to do a hardbound copy version. And so I decided to go through a publishing house. There it is. Yeah. I wanted to use a printer rather than going through Amazon and having them do it because I wanted to have a lot of control. So I found a very nice printing company not far from Seattle that had been in business for a long time. I had the great good fortune to meet a wonderful book designer. I mean, I've been very pleased with the design and most people seem to think it looks good. So I worked with her and my husband actually did the little silhouette. He's an artist, so he came up with this silhouette thing on the front. And I actually met the designer in person and I took some books that I like with me to show her what I wanted. And then I also took some books I didn't like just to kind of test her. And she was like, that one, no, so. And then also the interior is so important. She did a really nice job on the interior. She told me what kind of paper to use. So yeah, and then, so I printed a first run of hardbound copies. I was fortunate that the poet laureate of Washington State read the manuscript and gave me a very nice blurb. And this is something also, should one get to the point of self-publishing, you do need to find some influencer, somebody with a name to read your manuscript and give you some kind words that you can put on the cover. It really helps to up the quality in readers' minds. And and then the other, yeah, and then I had a launch party. I had my own launch party. I rented this hall. I invited everybody I knew and had refreshments, and about more than 50 people came, and I sold about that many books, and so that was great. It was a great way to launch. And then I had a neighbor who said to me one day, guess who I just saw walking down the street? And this was actually before the publication. This was before I actually moved into publishing. Guess who I just saw walking down the street? I said, I don't know. Who did you see walking down the street? She said, I saw Nancy Pearl. I said, oh, everybody knows Nancy Pearl? Do you know Nancy Pearl, Gina? She's called America's Librarian. tell everybody who Nancy Pearl is, Angie.
She's written books called Book Lust, and then she has what the show that you were on called, is it called Book Lust?
That's the Book Lust, yeah.
She has a little action figure made after her, a Nancy Pearl action figure, because she's like a librarian, but she's an author herself now with in the last couple of years she had some.
Yeah.
And but she's nationally known as a influential book person.
Yeah. So I said, oh, that's interesting. She said, yeah, she lives in our neighborhood. So I thought, oh. And so I looked her up on the white pages, and she literally lives like 5 minutes from where I live. And I take walks all over the neighborhood. I may have probably passed her condo 300 times. So I wrote her a letter, a paper letter. And I said, Nancy, I have my manuscript now, this manuscript now with an agent, and we're not getting much traction. I wonder if you might take a look at it. And I knew that she was also a fan of Barbara Pym. So I pitched that. So lo and behold, she wrote back, or I emailed me back and said, sure, I'll take a look at it. So I carted the little manuscript down and left it on her doorstep. And then I didn't hear from her. So I thought, oh, well, whatever. And then to kind of rattle the cage a little bit, maybe 2 months later, something like that, I said, oh, hi, Nancy, I wonder if I might pick up that manuscript. Oh, sure. So she put it on her doorstep and I took it away. Okay, done. So then when my self-published book came out, I thought, oh, what the heck? I'm just going to go give Nancy Pearl a copy of this book. Why not? So I trotted down and had it in a little envelope and put it on her, wrote her a note, put it on her doorstep, walked away. And then about a week later, she emailed me and she said, oh, I got your book, it looks good, I wonder. And she was like, kind of like really kind of like begging me, or kind of like really humble. I wonder would you like to, I wonder if you might consider being on my TV show. I'm like, well, I don't know. No. Of course, I was thrilled. So that was a wonderful thing for this book. And the fact that I had a hardbound book made it very attractive to libraries. So I was able to get it into a whole bunch of libraries in Washington State. And also, the other thing I did was I sent a copy to Alexander McCall Smith. See, I just do things like this. I just figure what can hurt, So I sent a hardbound copy to Alexander McCall Smith, and he wrote me back.
Oh, wow.
And he sent me a little chapbook of his poetry and little short writings that he'd done. So, you just kind of do things like that if you want to get your book out there. And then I have a connection, people who like this author, Barbara Pym, like her so much that there's actually a Barbara Pym Society in the UK, and they have a branch in the Northeast America in Boston, Cambridge and Boston. So I've gone to their conference, and that helped me they have my book and they reviewed it for their newsletter. And so it's gotten itself around. And some monk or some priest in an abbey in southern France found it and read it. I mean, it's kind of funny how a book travels around. Yeah. I frankly would not advise anyone to self-publish if they can at all help it, because it's a lot of work. It costs a lot of money. I have less problem with the money than the work. You have to be very detailed oriented. You need to know how to do lots of things, like get your ISBN number, get your, my battery's going down here, get your copyright, how to get it on the Amazon, how to get it on Ingram. I mean, it's pretty complicated. And in the best of all worlds, you'd have someone do that stuff for you. But if you've already spent a bunch of money on your design and your editing, you're probably not going to want to do that. Excuse me while I get my plug for my computer.
Okay. While she's doing that, I was just going to remind folks that we do have a couple of copies of the book in Carnegie-Stout collection. And it looks like we don't have a huge crowd here. So the default winner here is Cinda. You have a copy of this, a nice hardcover copy. I'm going to give my sister, who is also here,
Thank you.
and she's a family member. So, you can come get
Wow.
this at the reference desk. We'll put this.
Thank you
there
so
for you.
much.
You're
It's,
welcome.
Yay.
I like writing poetry, but I love you authors that love to write. So keep it up.
Thank you, Cinda. Is any of your poetry available for us to read?
It's just, it may come out in the next Writers Guild if they get it published this spring, my newest one, but I've been in that, but I've not done anything else.
The
Okay.
Dubuque, the Dubuque
Other than
Writers,
keep them together.
the Dubuque
Yeah.
Writers Guild group, is that the one?
Yes.
Yeah. So for people watching this as a recording, you can obviously check out Carnegie-Stout's copies of these books, but they're also available for sale on Amazon.
Correct, yeah.
Right,
And
yeah.
if someone would like an inscribed copy, I have both, I can get both hardbounds and softbounds and inscribe them. But to get those, you have to go through my website, which is betsyhansonauthor.com. And another little pitch, in February, starting on February 25th, the Galena Arts Center is going to be doing a table read of one of my plays.
Yeah, I just
just
read that
by-
today.
Just by donation, but it could be quite a bit of fun. And there's also an audio drama version of the same play that's available on YouTube. It's called New Digs. You can just look up Betsy Hanson author YouTube and it'll pop up. That was my COVID project. I got these, we did it all, remotely. We did all the recording remotely. Yeah.
Well, I
Yeah,
feel like I could. Sorry, go ahead, Cinda.
No, I was just going to say, I just got the newsletter from the Galena Arts Council and how they had put your little blurb in there and to make it into a play. And I thought, I don't want to miss tonight.
Oh, that's good. Thank you.
See you.
Thank you. My sister lives in Galena, so that's a connection I have through.
That's great.
And I did a presentation for their library too, which was really fun. There's such great
Thank you,
people
Cinda.
there.
That's the nice thing about, I mean, it's hard to say it, but with everything going virtual, we're able to do events, where you might not have been taking a trip here, although you do have the local connection, but still we get to hang with you
Yeah.
all the way in Seattle, and and all of our library patrons can benefit that from a distance. So
I think we've learned something. I think we've
Yeah.
learned something about what we can do, and how this is a really great tool. Yeah. Well, I hope I've covered things that you're interested in, and this has been useful.
absolutely.
I love coming to things like this and thank our library for providing it and thank you authors for
Well, thank you, Angie,
adding
for
to my.
being